Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty interesting figure, someone who's been called both a revolutionary hero
hmm
and, well, frankly, a villain for some of his later actions.
Oh, yeah, this should be good.
We're talking about Martin Luther, the guy who kicked off the whole Protestant Reformation.
Definitely an important guy, but what's really cool about this deep dive, I think, is that we're moving past that image everyone has in their head of him nailing the 95 Theses to the church door. We're going beyond that.
Right, right.
And we're really going to dig into what happened after that, like how his ideas really started to take hold and completely reshape Europe. It got messy.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of messy, the sources we've got for this one, it seems like, paint a pretty different picture of this guy. I mean, we're talking about a Luther who's dealing with the consequences, like the unintended and often chaotic consequences of all those radical ideas he put out there.
For sure. It's a good reminder that even revolutions that start with, the best intentions, they can turn violent and, create a ton of division. It makes you think, where's the line between revolutionary and actually being reactionary?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was Luther a true revolutionary, or did he become the very thing he was fighting against? That's what we're trying to figure out.
Exactly. And to do that, I think we got to look at how he reacted to, well, some of the things that spun out of his own teachings, like the Peasants' War in 1525.
Oh, man. That wasn't just some little protest. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of peasants across Germany, full-on revolt. And what were they demanding? An end to serfdom and a more just fair social order.
And you know what's crazy? They were inspired by Luther's own ideas, about Christian freedom and sola scriptura, that idea that the Bible is the ultimate authority.
It's like they looked at Luther and thought, hey, this guy gets it. He stood up to the Pope. He stood up to the whole Catholic Church. He'll be on our side against the ruling class.
Makes sense, right? You'd think so.
You'd think. But here's where things get interesting.
Yeah.
Luther, at first, he did have some sympathy for these peasants, for their struggles. But then
All right.
he did a complete 180. He ends up siding with the princes. And not just siding, he actually encouraged them to put down the rebellion brutally.
Oh, yeah. He even wrote this whole pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants. Talk about inflammatory. It's like he was calling for violence against the very people who saw him as their hero.
Wow. That's a big shift. What caused that? What made him change his mind so drastically?
I think a lot of it came down to fear. Luther was terrified of chaos. He really believed that even flawed authorities, earthly authorities, were absolutely vital to keeping society from falling apart.
So he chose stability, basically, even if it meant going against, those ideals of freedom and justice that he was so passionate about before. I imagine a lot of his followers felt pretty betrayed by that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this whole internal conflict within the Reformation, well, it just gets even more intense when you bring in guys like Andreas Karlstadt and Thomas Müntzer.
These guys, they basically threw gasoline on an already raging fire, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he must have been a real thorn in Luther's side.
Totally. So Karlstadt starts out as a close friend of Luther, a supporter even, but then he starts pushing for these reforms that even Luther thought were too radical. Like he wanted to get rid of music and imagery in church services. He thought it was distracting from true worship. And then he went and renounced all his fancy academic titles and started living like a pauper,
Yeah.
trying to show solidarity with the common people.
He was almost trying to out Luther. It's no wonder Luther felt betrayed by that.
Right. And so what does Luther do? Well, he publicly slams Karlstadt and uses all his influence to get him banished. It's a good example of how even people who challenge the status quo, once they get a taste of power, well, they don't always like it when someone challenges them.
That's true. And it shows you how easily these movements can break apart. Disagreements over, how fast change should happen and just how far you should go.
Yeah.
It can lead to all sorts of infighting.
Absolutely. And then you've got Thomas Müntzer. No, this guy, he was a firebrand.
He was convinced that the world was about to end, like literally, and that the only way to usher in God's kingdom was through violent revolution.
Right. Talk about a radical. And he saw Luther siding with the princes as the ultimate betrayal. He called Luther a godless mound of flesh even. Can you believe that?
Godless mound of flesh.
I
Wow.
don't
He didn't hold back.
Nope, not at all. And Müntzer wasn't just talking. He was leading a whole faction of peasants in the rebellion. He went into battle carrying a white flag with a rainbow on it and the slogan, "May the word of God endure forever."
Powerful imagery.
Oh, yeah. It shows how symbols and slogans, they're not just words. They can really rally people to a cause.
So what happened to Müntzer in the end?
Well, his army got crushed at the Battle of Frankenhausen. He was captured, tortured, and executed. A pretty grim reminder that challenging the powers that be can have serious consequences.
Revolutions can be brutal, that's for sure. Even if Müntzer lost, his death probably made him a martyr to a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. And his legacy, it continued to haunt Luther and all those reformers who were trying to find a more moderate, peaceful path.
So we've seen how Luther dealt with the aftermath of the Peasants' War and how people like Karlstadt and Müntzer challenged him. How did all this affect his views on authority and religion?
That's a great question, and that's actually what we're going to be diving into next time.
Stay tuned.
Oh.
It's crazy how these events really forced Luther to, like, put his money where his mouth is,
Yeah.
you know? We were just talking about the Peasants' War and how, well, some people saw him as selling out. So how did all this shape his views on authority, like the whole role of religion?
Well, if you look at his later writings, it's clear he really started to emphasize obedience to secular authorities, even when they weren't perfect.
That seems kind of, well, I don't know, contradictory, right? I mean, this is the guy who challenged the Pope, the biggest authority in the church. And now he's saying people should obey even flawed leaders. How did he square those two things?
He always saw a difference between the spiritual and the secular, like two different realms.
Okay.
In the spiritual realm, he was all about freedom through faith. But in the secular world, he thought you absolutely needed strong leadership to keep things from, falling apart. It's like that old saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
So he wasn't saying let's have anarchy.
Yeah.
He just thought you needed like a balance, right, between personal faith and the rules of society. But didn't his whole thing about sola scriptura, everyone interpreting the Bible for themselves, didn't that lead to a more individualistic view of religion?
You're right. That's a key point. When Luther said the Bible is the only source of religious authority, well, he was basically bypassing the whole church hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And that had huge consequences. It sort of unintentionally maybe led to people having a much more personal, individual approach to faith.
It's like he democratized religion.
Yeah.
Gave people the power to read the Bible and decide what it meant for them.
Exactly. It created a sense of religious autonomy. People became responsible for their own spiritual journey, and that even if he didn't plan it, really laid the groundwork for secularism. The idea that religion and government should be separate.
It's amazing how these ideas that came out of theological debates, they ended up having such a huge impact on like the whole social and political landscape of Europe.
Ideas are powerful, that's for sure. But we do have to admit that Luther's legacy isn't all, sunshine and roses.
You're talking about the anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to reconcile that with the Luther who fought for religious freedom. It's a dark side to him.
It's a reminder that even people who fight for positive change, even revolutionaries, they can still have really prejudiced and intolerant beliefs.
It's scary how he didn't just like talk about it. He actually encouraged people to persecute Jews. He wanted to burn synagogues, destroy their books, even force them into labor. Those aren't just words. They had real and terrible consequences.
It's a dark chapter, and historians still argue about it a lot. It makes us face the fact that even people we might consider heroes, well, they can have really messed up beliefs.
So how do we deal with this? On one hand, he's a revolutionary who changed Western civilization. But on the other, he's a bigot who spread hate and persecution.
We can't just erase or ignore parts of history. We have to look at the whole picture, the good and the bad. Recognize that people, even famous people, are complex. We can admire their achievements while also condemning their dark sides.
It's like history isn't a simple story, right? It's messy and full of contradictions.
And the people who make history, they're just as messy and contradictory.
Luther's story is kind of a warning, I think, about what happens when someone gets too much power. Even someone who started out fighting for good things. I mean, he challenged the church, but then that same authority he gained, he used it against others.
It raises a big question, doesn't it? Can any revolution, no matter how good its goals are, can it ever avoid becoming violent and divided? That's something revolutionaries throughout history have had to deal with.
And we're still dealing with it today.
Yeah.
Look at all the social and political movements happening right now. They all have their own internal struggles. They're all trying to figure out how to use power responsibly. How do you fight for your ideals while also being, practical? How do you keep your own biases in check? Those are really important questions. It seems like Luther's life shows us that this human struggle for freedom and justice and meaning, it's never really over. It's always there, and it always comes with compromises and unexpected consequences. It's not always a straight line towards progress. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to take away from all this?
Well, that's actually what we're going to be talking about next time. We'll try to wrap it all up.
Man, Luther's life. He was like a roller coaster, right? Up and down, contradictions everywhere. We've seen him as this revolutionary, this reformer, and yeah, even as someone who caused a lot of division and intolerance. So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what do we even make of his legacy? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think his story really pushes us to ask some tough questions, like can any revolution really succeed without turning violent and breaking apart? What's the line between personal freedom and, keeping society stable? And maybe the biggest question of all, how do we square those really inspiring things about him, like fighting for religious freedom, with some of his darker, more hateful beliefs?
Yeah, those are big questions, and they're not just about Luther, are they? They're about all of us. Even today, it's like he's this historical mirror, Everyone sees something different in him. Hero, villain, somewhere in between.
That's what makes history so fascinating. It's not black and white. It's full of gray areas, and it forces us to really think and wrestle with these complex figures. We can't just simplify everything.
We're not just looking back at events, are we? We're trying to understand the ideas and the choices that shaped, well, everything. And even if some of those choices make us uncomfortable today, we have to try to understand them in their own context. Not to say they were right, but to learn from them.
You're right. We can learn from history without, agreeing with everything that happened back then. It's about getting a grip on how we got to where we are, the good and the bad, and hopefully not repeat the mistakes.
So why should we, in the 21st century, care about this 16th century monk and his theological battles?
Because those core issues he struggled with, they're still relevant. We still fight about the balance between individual freedom and the common good, about the place of faith in a world that's becoming more and more secular, about how to deal with all this crazy change happening all around us. Luther's story, messy as it is, it can help us think about those things in a new way.
It's like history isn't just a bunch of facts in a textbook, right? It's a story that's still unfolding, and we're all part of it.
Exactly. Luther's story reminds us that history is full of twists and turns. It can be unpredictable. And we need to be humble about it, What we think we know about the past, it can change as we learn more.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into Martin Luther's world, I gotta say, go check out his writings, learn about the Reformation, really dig into the time period. There's so much to discover, and it can really change how you see the world.
And while you're exploring, think about this. What if Luther hadn't come up with this idea of two kingdoms, separating the spiritual from the secular? Would we even have the concept of secularism today like we do? It's something to ponder.
Interesting. Well, thanks for joining us on this wild ride through Martin Luther's life. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep digging into history. It's full of surprises.